unethical practices that drive up the volume of the hospital's business. That happens in real life, not just in novels. Um, Actually, prioritizing certain patients over another based on what kind of insurance they have and their ability to pay for things like transplantation. That happens in real life, not just in my novels. But there's not just economic disparities in healthcare. There's racial disparities in healthcare, and all the way through. It doesn't matter what area of medicine you study. It's present. It's present in transplantation, which seems like it would be one of the more fair areas of medicine. But I studied this while I was at Stanford with a group of researchers there. And there's racial disparities throughout the transplant process. Who gets referred for a transplant, who makes it on the waiting list, their likelihood of getting an organ once they're on the waiting list. I mean, you name it, it's there. And so we've got major challenges in healthcare that I think a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, go back to money.
Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges. The brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Hey, welcome to The Exploding Human. My name is Bob Nickman. My guest today is Dr. David Weill, and we're going to be talking about the 25 years he spent as a lung transplant surgeon and some of the medical ethics involved, the decision-making about who gets a transplant and who doesn't, some of the medical advances that are making transplant surgeries less needed, and his current novel, All That Really Matters, which is a fictional work that explores the demands, challenges, and complications of a transplant surgeon. And through this book, we get to find out some of the more behind-the-scenes world of what it's like to be a surgeon and to make these life-and-death decisions about who gets a transplant, who doesn't, some medical ethics, corporate greed, and what he sees as the future of transplant surgery. So let's get into this. Here he is. This is Dr. David Weill. David Weill is in New Orleans. I am in Los Angeles, and we're going to talk about a lot of interesting topics in his new book, which is dealing with, well, we were just talking before, and we're going to talk about ethics and some of the things that medical ethics and some of the things that are going on in medicine. But why don't you give a little background to our wonderful listeners so they know who I'm talking to?
So I am a lung transplant physician. I've been in the transplant arena for 25 years. I spent most of my career at Stanford, where I headed the lung transplant program there. And I moved back to my hometown of New Orleans after being away for 26 years and started a consulting practice where I help transplant programs that are underperforming, and started writing books almost as soon as I moved back home, and published a memoir in 2021 about the emotional ups and downs of doing transplant work. And I told a lot of patient stories and revealed a little bit about myself. It was called Exhale. And my new book that's just out actually yesterday is a novel called All That Really Matters, that follows a protagonist who is a transplant surgeon who has a steep rise in his career and gets himself into all kind of trouble and tries to find a way out of it. It's a story that's a romantic story. It's a love story in a lot of different ways. And he sacrifices a lot to do his career, and then ultimately looks for redemption after he nearly loses everything.
Well, let's just talk about this character for a minute, because I spent a lot of years as a TV writer and other types of writing myself. So I love everything comes from character, of course. That's my take on it. And so this meteoric rise of this character, and we're going to get into the medical stuff, folks. You wellness fans, don't worry about it. We're going to do that, but we're going to talk a little bit about writing here. Was he driven by
money and fame? Are those the things that drove this character to do things that were questionable? And is that something you've witnessed? And is that something that happened to you, or you were a temptation, perhaps?
Well, you'll see from the opening scene in the novel that this guy had very high expectations put on him by mostly his father, who was an accomplished physician, a Nobel Prize laureate, expected a lot out of his only son. And my main character, Dr. Joe Bosco, also put very high expectations on himself. And he reveals throughout this process all of the ethical and moral questions we have when we're doing these life and death kind of operations. And as he started to consider himself a godlike figure, that's when things really started to unravel for him.
Well, that is a fascinating idea, because I think there's that is a danger of, and most people wouldn't even think about it, not including myself. But you're a physician that essentially saves lives, so you are, in a sense, doing a godlike thing. You're saving a human life. How do you, how does somebody do that and not let their ego get out of, go unchecked, like that, and keep it in check, and realize that you're basically just, you're doing a service for another person. You're not actually God. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's interesting as my career went along, and I started my transplant career when I was very young. And as it went along, I thought all of the patient's successes were due to me and me only. But of course, that means all the failures are due to you and to you only. And it was only really later in my career that I found that I just had a piece of the outcome. In other words, I didn't have full responsibility for either the successes or the failures. But that's something that, as a young man, you really do think you can control an inherently uncontrollable process. And the learning that's required, and I show this in my character in the novel, he transforms himself into somebody that's actually much more balanced toward the end of the book.
Was there a certain event or series of events that did that? Like what humbled you? Let's just talk about you for a second, because I'm sure this character in this book came out of your own experience. Obviously it has, because that's, what you're saying in a sense. What happened that you, some of it is youth. Yeah. I mean, we're all sort of cocky in our youth, especially if we're good at something. It's inevitable. I'm great. Everyone thinks that when they do great shit when they're young. What happened? I mean, how did you get humbled? Let's put it that way, or get it in perspective.
I think two things happened to me, and the characters in my book are, none of them are me or even any one individual. They're combinations of people I saw during the course of my career. I had a lot of rich material. Not hard to find a character for a novel in the kind of work that I did. But to your question, there were two things that changed me as a physician. Not only just aging, but when I had my own children was the first thing. And then the second thing was when my father died, and he actually was a transplant recipient himself. And so sort of early in my career, he got a transplant. He did very well, actually, after the transplant. But when he passed away, he and I were very close, and it had a real impact on me. So, we in medicine go into the field when we're very young, but stuff happens to us over the course of our lives that impact how we practice medicine. And that certainly happened to me.
Yeah. Was it a, like an understanding that came of how tenuous life can be?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think also, and I know many of your listeners have children. I think also your heart changes when you have your own kids. You become very vulnerable. And I was taking care of a lot of kids and a lot of sick 15, 16-year-olds. And so I was actually seeing my kids and those kids and comparing. And, at some point, everybody became my own children, my patients, and they were all my mother, they were all my father, they were all my kids. And I no longer had that distance, the emotional distance that I think they taught us in medical school to have, actually. I no longer had that toward the end of my run in the hospital.
Well, that's an interesting thing to teach a physician, and I understand why that might be necessary in terms of, not having too much backlash, emotional, trauma for yourself for caring too much. But is it possible? Is it possible that caring more is maybe makes a better physician? It's sort of a balancing act, I would imagine. I mean, I don't do anything like that. So, but I can only imagine how do you not care about another person, especially when you're inside their body, giving them a new part? I don't see how that would even be possible to remove yourself. Obviously, you have to do that when the particular surgery is over. You have to go to the next patient. So you have to muster that kind of, fortitude to go on to that next person. But I don't see how a human being could not become emotionally attached in those situations.
I think many physicians do, but you'd be surprised at how many don't. I think to some doctors and nurses, it is just a job, and they go home and they sort of move on with their lives. That doesn't mean they can't do their job well, or that they want the patients to do badly. I mean, I think really nurses and doctors want their patients to do well, but they maintain an emotional detachment. And I think I had some of that earlier in my career, but I lost that pretty quickly. And in fact, toward the end of my career, it was really all emotion. I was pretty exposed at that point for a variety of reasons, including the birth of my children and the loss of my father. And also, I think over many years of seeing some patients live and some patients die, I think it takes its toll. And that's why I decided at a relatively young age to step out of the clinical arena.
I applaud anybody that can be a physician. I don't have the makeup to do that. So I think it's amazing that we have people that can actually, one, get through medical school. That's kind of an amazing feat in itself. I was mentioning that my daughter's in medical school, and what a brutal process that goes on in there.
Yeah, just to get in.
Just to get in, yeah. And then that sort of competitive nature that has to be a part of that to get in, and to strive for that. And then it continues, because those are the type of people that get into medical school. And it seems like it continues, even though it doesn't have to be competitive in that sense, because you're either going to pass your tests and certifications and all that stuff, or you're not. It doesn't really have anything to do with somebody else. I don't think. It doesn't seem that way to me, but maybe there are limited amounts of slots for different disciplines. I suppose that may be where the competition comes in. I mean, it seems like a process that maybe is flawed a little bit. I'm not sure the AMA has really figured out the best way to create a good pool of physicians.
I think you're right. I think medical education is fairly antiquated, and I think it's not teaching people really to be, the humanistic part of medicine, the compassion. I think it's pretty good at teaching us the mechanics of being a doctor, but from a humanitarian standpoint, not so much. And I think COVID and some of the sequelae of COVID might help that a little bit, but we have a long way to go.
Well, I'm glad that I'm hearing an actual physician say the things that I've been thinking, because, I get to interview a lot of different people, from, I'll use the word conventional physicians to alternative, or, functional medicine people that aren't even actually, they're not MDs, but they are healers of various disciplines. So I'm fascinated by the whole spectrum of how we can help each other in, all the different areas. It seems very sort of bent toward the mechanics and the science of that, which is obviously essential, but not so much in the other realms. That's what sort of leading to, I want to talk about the ethics thing here in a second.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. I in talking to patients, especially, I learned so much from them by taking a more humanistic approach than I did just firing off medical questions at them, the second they sat down in my exam room. I think that helped me relate to them, I think, a little bit better.
Well, see, the first thing is if somebody's coming to a doctor for something, they're worried. Some of them are even terrified, depending on
Sure.
what the condition is. And so, how do you deal with? I mean, it's part psychology. It's part. It's a spirit. There's a spiritual piece to it to connect to that other person's, inner self, and gain a certain amount of trust that there's nothing worse to me than being with a doctor who doesn't have a sense of compassion. I find that so, I mean, I won't do it. If I sense that that's what's going on, I'll find somebody else.
No, I agree with you. And when I receive healthcare, I notice right away who has it and who doesn't. It's pretty obvious.
Even to putting your hand on somebody's shoulder, simple physical connection. This is my own thoughts.
No,
well, everything is my own thoughts, or I wouldn't say them.
No, I think you're right though, and I think that there's ways as doctors to demonstrate to patients that we care about them as a human being, and they're not just a bunch of data points that we need to connect the dots on. And fortunately, I had some mentors early in my medical career who taught me that, and I think it's really important, and now more than ever.
So let's talk about some of these ethical questions that you raise in your book and that are sort of becoming, I guess there's probably new ethical questions with the advent of stem cells, those kind of protocols that are coming, the regenerative medicine piece that's happening. Certainly there's people that would say transplants are not something that should be done. I don't personally know anyone that thinks that, but I'm sure there are people that think that that's creepy in some way. It's macabre. It's unless you're the person that needs one, then it's fantastic.
Right. I mean, I think most people really feel like transplants, obviously a life-saving procedure and is necessary. I do think there are people out there during the course of my career that have pointed out to me how expensive it is, which it is, and whether or not saving one life at a time via an expensive surgery and an expensive post-operative recovery like transplant is the best use of our healthcare dollars. I don't agree with that point of view, but nonetheless, I think there is an argument to be made about how much money should be spent, saving one life at a time versus providing prenatal care, to people that can't afford it, or diabetes care to people who can't afford it. That's a debate that could be had. Obviously, I'm a transplant doctor. I believe heavily in transplantation. It's a very important part, with over 42,000 people a year getting a solid organ transplant, and about 110,000 waiting on a transplant every year. This affects a lot of people. If you multiply that by the family members and the friends and everything else, it's a pretty big number.
And we all know people. I mean, more than anybody, but we all know people who've had transplants. I know several people that have had liver transplants.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. I mentioned as a physician when my father received a liver transplant just a few years into my career, and he developed a disease, cirrhosis, hepatitis C cirrhosis of his liver, and he would have essentially been dead within a few weeks had he not gotten the transplant. And we got to be with him for 12 more years after the transplant. I mean, what's that worth? To our family, quite a bit.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, it really is a beautiful thing to be able to save somebody's life and have them go on, and that's a lot of years.
Yep.
I had a friend that just had a liver transplant a few years ago, and he's doing okay, and it was very touch and go for a while. I was very happy to see that he's still around, doing well. It's a great thing to see. So what are some of the ethical questions that you raise in your book?
I think one of the most important things that I noticed in my career and actually put it into my novel is the basic putting profit over purpose in healthcare. And so, money is really taking over our healthcare. I know that that's not going to shock anybody, but it is a major driving force in healthcare. It's the primary driving force in healthcare right now. And I tried to demonstrate in my novel that how does that really manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself by all kind of different things, unethical practices that drive up the volume of the hospital's business. That happens in real life, not just in novels. Actually prioritizing certain patients over another based on what kind of insurance they have and their ability to pay for things like transplantation. That happens in real life, not just in my novels. But there's not just economic disparities in healthcare. There's racial disparities in healthcare, and all the way through. It doesn't matter what area of medicine you study. It's present. It's present in transplantation, which seems like it would be one of the more fair areas of medicine. But I studied this while I was at Stanford with a group of researchers there. And there's racial disparities throughout the transplant process. Who gets referred for a transplant, who makes it on the waiting list, their likelihood of getting an organ once on the waiting list. I mean, you name it, it's there. And so we've got major challenges in healthcare that I think a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, go back to money. And I'm not smart enough, and I don't think anyone is, to figure out a way to strip the profit motive out of transplantation. And I'm a card carrying, out of healthcare, I'm a card carrying capitalist, and I have no problem whatsoever with individuals making money doing things. What I do have a problem with was in something like healthcare, when that's all it's about. And I see that both in my own experience working in the hospital and now as a consultant to a variety of different hospitals, both nationally and internationally. Profit motive is a big deal in healthcare, and it really impacts patients.
Even my own doctor was telling me that the people at the top of the the medical practice that he's under, which is a big, hospital and all that. And it's because they're all MBAs. They're not actually even doctors.
Yeah. I mean, sorry to interrupt there, just because there's a very dramatic graph that's out there somewhere where the number of physicians, clinicians, let's just call them, in our country over the last several decades is absolutely flat. There's no increase. There's been the same number roughly as a percentage of our population of physicians over many decades. But the number of hospital administrators has gone up in a straight line. And I'm not diminishing their role in all of this, but I'm not sure we need as many of them as we have. We have a lot of people being paid in medicine that never lay a hand on a patient.
Yeah.
So
I think that happens. That's happening in a lot of businesses too.
I bet.
I was in show business for a very long time, and I saw over the decades that I was in it, I saw more people in the administration kind of part, the development part, the non-creative parts, more jobs in those areas and less jobs for creative people, to the detriment of the creativity. And it was rough, the moat between the creative and the public got wider and wider and wider. And you see money in politics, you see it in everything. And it's there is a pervasive kind of cultural, I think it's a big problem, a cultural problem, that money has become something above all else.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly problematic in healthcare because, if you're running Apple or you're running a car company or an airline and you want to squeeze profit out of it, it probably actually doesn't really hurt individuals the way it does in healthcare. But in healthcare, the profit motive, we're not an assembly line, making a computer here. I mean, we're actually trying to treat patients, and it just doesn't work that well in that setting when all you try to do is maximize profit. It just doesn't work. It might in another industry like a computer maker.
Well, even that, it's just a false god. It's a false belief that should be the thing. It's a piece of it, like you said. When you were talking about, I don't know why, I kept thinking about this when you were talking about teenagers having to have lung transplants. It was really kind of hit me, because I don't think about that very much. Obviously, I never think about it because I'm not a teenager. I don't have one that needs a transplant. But what is it? Are these mostly like, if you have, you're saying 15, 16-year-olds having lung transplants? I want to go back to that for a second. What is the most what is the reason for that? It's not because they're smoking, because they're too young to have that.
No.
It's it takes a while for smoking to be the reason.
Yeah, these are more inherited diseases like cystic fibrosis, other kind of pulmonary fibrosis diseases that can either be inherited or just bad luck diseases. So while it's not particularly common anymore to have to transplant somebody with cystic fibrosis that young, in fact, things have gotten so good for CF that we're transplanting less and less of those patients altogether, which is fantastic. But those are there's also kids that age that need liver transplants and heart transplants that are born with it, congenital abnormalities of their heart. And it's heartbreaking because those kids never had a chance at a normal life.
I'm always interested about transplants because, this may be a little bit movie-ish, but when somebody gets the organ of somebody else, how they're changed. Now, I did have a friend who had a complete bone marrow transplant. Mm-hmm. He was a decades-long, 30-year vegetarian. Mm-hmm. And the doctor said to him, "You have a different blood type now. You may want meat." And he goes, "No." He goes, "I haven't had meat in 30 years. He goes, "On the way home from the hospital, I pulled into In-N-Out and got a burger. I had to have it."
Yeah. I've actually seen that. It's amazing. There's something, and we're never going to, well, I don't think we're ever going to know what this is. There's something, the taste actually does change. I've had that with a number of patients where their taste buds are different. They want different foods, just like the person you're referencing. So I've definitely seen that. I can't say that I've seen patients take on the characteristics of their donor in any other way. No, I've seen tons of patients, the majority, I would say, that from an attitude standpoint are different after a transplant. That's very common. They're very common. Okay. I mean, you've already sort of faced death once, and you have now this second life. Most patients change after that. I saw very few patients that just said, "Well, that's great. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing." That was uncommon. Most people, were like shot out of a cannon. They couldn't believe that they got another chance to live, and boy, were they going to make the most of it. And they did. They did all the things that people do. They, ran marathons, climbed mountains, jumped out of airplanes, you name it. But it was so gratifying to see that, because you saw somebody that really felt like they had the ultimate reset in their life. It was great.
When you think about, how many people go, "Well, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it next year." And they don't. Right. Because life has a way of sort of just going, and the daily deal, you just sort of survive, and you go, and then it's 5 years later and you haven't done this thing that you've wanted to. And I would think something like that, where all of a sudden you've got a second act that other people don't get, in a sense. In a sense, you kill one person and you come out being another person. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, now I get it.
Yeah, I had this question.
I'm going to quit my job.
No, I had this question. I actually asked patients. It drove my nurses crazy because they heard me ask it thousands of times. When patients would come to see me about a transplant, I would ask them, again, I wanted to get to know them a little bit. And so I asked them, "What would you do if today was your last day?" And the answers I heard were like a master class in figuring out what really matters. And it's so interesting what people told me. Not surprisingly to your listeners, not one talked about work, or mostly it wasn't about money, about work, or about ambition or success. It was really about fostering interpersonal relationships, or developing a more spiritual life. And it was great to hear, though. And it was a great way to get patients to talk.
I think there was something I read about, somebody did a study or some kind of research on the biggest regrets people have on their deathbeds, or or when they're dying. And the number one thing was the regret for things they didn't try.
No doubt.
Things they didn't do,
Yep.
not things that they failed at, but things they didn't even try.
I totally agree with that. And I think that that's very common. Getting to things tomorrow is not a winning strategy. You really need to get to them soon because we just don't know how long we're all going to be here. Not to bring the whole conversation down, but we just don't know.
Yeah, I don't see that as bringing it down. I think it's bringing it into sharp focus where, that is a big question. If today is the last day or tomorrow, what would you do anything different? What would that be? I think it's a great question. I think that the keeping in mind, not in a morbid way, the fact that you're going to die is an important impetus for how you live. I've always had that in myself. It's like and I remember thinking when I was trying different things as a younger guy and even on into, later in life, am I going to and I would ask myself, if I don't do this, how am I going to feel at the end? Now, not to say I haven't been afraid to try shit, because I have.
No, I think the fear is normal. Change is hard for humans, and I think that that fear is healthy. But mostly the happiest people I know are the people that are trying new and different things, especially as we age. I think it's easy to get stuck in our same pattern.
Well, you obviously did that. You left one facet of medicine and now you're doing something completely different.
Yeah.
Well, not completely different, but it's a natural sort of segue into something. It seems like a broader spectrum of people that you can help rather than like a specific surgery and you're under the umbrella of a hospital. And it's, I'm sure the hours are pretty intense and the emotion's pretty high and there's a lot of stress. I would imagine that would be all part of that. And now you're able to, well, tell us what you're doing now.
Yeah. So in addition to the writing, I actually have transplant programs, transplant hospitals as my consulting clients. They're both national and international. And what I do with a team of people is we go in and we try to fix broken transplant programs that they're having struggles of various sorts, or they want to start a new transplant program, and we help come in and set it up because I've done quite a bit of that in my career. And so I'm more at this point coach than quarterback. I've really enjoyed it. It's really been great because to your point, I think I can have a broader effect than I can transplanting one patient after another in a single program. I also work with companies that are doing some great new innovative stuff in transplant, and that's rewarding as well because we can partner to make things better for patients, and I think that that's really gratifying. It's been great.
What are some of the newest cutting edge kinds of things that are happening in transplants? And because this is a topic I don't know anything about. I don't even want to know about it except for today. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to transplant them.
I do. I always tell people that hopefully we can meet personally and not professionally. But in full disclosure, I serve on a board of a company called Transmedics, who I think is doing an unbelievable service to the transplant community by having an organ storage device that can actually keep the organs alive for longer. Traditionally in transplantation, it's this race in the middle of the night to go get the organs. Yeah. You've seen the, Grey's Anatomy and everything else. That's how the transplant's been. You get called at 2 a.m, you get out of bed, you fly out, you pick up the organ, a 2-hour flight away, and you come back home usually exhausted and have to put the organ in. This device actually takes the hurry out of it. It keeps the organs alive, whether it's heart, lung, liver, and actually allows daytime surgeries, which I think keeps the transplant team fresher because they can wait until the sun comes up and do the transplant. And they've set up a whole network that will keep transplant doctors at their home base, and the organs will come to them rather than they're going out and getting the organs. And that may sound like a fairly obvious transformation, but it's really, truly revolutionary in our field. And so I think that that's the biggest thing impacting transplantation right now.
I had no idea that the doctor who's doing the transplant has to go get the organ and bring it back.
Somebody on the team does, whether it's the actual doctor doing the transplant or somebody else. And what it does is we don't have, and no hospital has hundreds of transplant surgeons laying around, waiting to work.
Yeah.
There's very few of them, and you don't want to burn them out by sending them out in the middle of the night after night after night. And so this is actually so great because the organs can come to you, And I
don't know why here's what I thought. I thought like somebody, dies in a car accident in Boston, and they've got a liver that's a nice young healthy liver for a person in Idaho, and a doctor in Boston takes it out and packs it in a bucket of ice, and a courier who's not even a doctor flies with this iced up liver to Idaho.
Not so much.
Okay.
Yeah, not so much. I mean, it really is the responsibility of the transplant program. So when I was on the West Coast in Stanford, the transplant procuring team was flying, all the way, everywhere west of the Mississippi, to get organs in the middle of the night. And, talk about, you do that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and that's not such an easy life. And, I've always thought, why do we do it this way? You have 100 transplant programs in the country. And if you, looked at a map of the United States, most of them are in the air on any given night. I think Transmedics, to their credit, has set up a rational distribution network that makes a lot of sense. It's a distribution model, where the organs come to the transplant hospital. And that's going to have a lot of positive effects on the field, because, just to be frank, we don't have enough people going into transplantation. A lot of young people coming up in medicine, they're not particularly attracted to transplant, generally. There's certainly people that are, but we have a problem, a man and woman power issue in transplantation, because the work is hard, emotionally and physically.
I was just thinking, like, if I'm on a plane, is there going to be there could be a guy sitting next to me with an organ in his lap, or is it?
we have private planes. We don't have to, we don't take Southwest Airlines.
But what if this is the way I think. I'm sorry. I just, I'm limited.
No, we, but I mean, bringing up the private plane issue is an interesting one, because also there's demand for private aviation now like there's never been before. And some of those folks that use private aviation are actually sucking up some of the planes from things like organ transplantation. So one of the things Transmedics is doing is creating its own Air Force, so that we're going to have planes available specifically for transplantation, and not flying folks around for golfing trips.
Okay.
Not that there's anything wrong with golfing trips.
Sorry, we can't get you that heart, because we need the plane for a golfing expo.
Right, exactly.
How can we have the need for transplants lessened? Are there things? Because some of the transplants, and I'm going to say some of the particularly liver transplants, I'm going to say, and maybe even heart, are the result of lifestyle choices that are not optimal for a healthy heart, liver, even lung. Especially with folks that are a little older, I think, that have maybe been living hard.
Yeah. I think actually you're seeing some of the diseases that are transplantable that have typically driven up the numbers of transplant, whether it's heart, lung, or liver, go down because of the medications that are available. I mean, my father got a transplant for hepatitis C. He got a bad blood transfusion when he got a hip replacement. Hepatitis C drugs are now so good that, it's obviating the need to do liver transplants. I mean, he probably wouldn't have gotten a liver transplant if he was, in the same situation today. That's true throughout. That's true for heart disease. That's also true for cystic fibrosis and lung disease. So the medication innovations have really lessened the need for transplant in specific areas. Now, some areas have also gone up as others have gone down. And to your point, that sort of diseases of abuse have continued to go up.
Yeah, I know several people that had to have liver transplants because of very heavy alcohol and drug abuse.
Right.
I have mixed feelings about it because, on one side, they have a possibility of going on and living a life if they stop the things that got them there. But two, it's like, well, you made those choices, and maybe that liver could go to somebody that didn't make those unwise choices.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. In my novel, I actually bring the reader inside what's called the selection room. It's kind of ominous sounding, but it's the committee that decides who gets a transplant and who doesn't. I had a little trouble doing that in my memoir. I did it a little bit because of the sensitivity of it, frankly, and couldn't bring you in as much as I could with the novel, where I actually explore a lot of the discussions that surround who gets an organ and who doesn't, who should live and who should die. Because, I would walk into work and sit in these rooms, and that's what I did for a job. That was my job. And, I bring the reader into those discussions because some were about, should somebody that did it to themselves, quote unquote, get an organ? What about the guy that got out of prison 9 months ago? Should that person get an organ? What about the person that's HIV positive that used IV drugs? Should that person get an organ? All these issues come up in our field all the time. There's moral issues, there's ethical issues, and we grappled with them. And I wanted the reader to understand that's our field. And that was what was liberating about writing fiction, is I could get into all of these without concern about offending anybody.
Getting inside this decision-making committee a little bit, how many people are usually on that decision-making? Is there a head person that makes a final decision?
Yeah.
How much emotion goes on in those rooms? Is there wielding of power behind the scenes to get, it's like, well, we're going to give the famous person a new heart, but not this other person.
All of those things are present, Bob. All of them come into the room, and I wrote about them in my book. There's politicking in there. There's flexing. There's ego. There's I was in charge of the lung transplant program at Stanford, and if I came in there and really wanted somebody transplanted, I probably could get that done, and sort of, just by virtue of being the person in charge. And all of that comes in. We used to really call it the poker game, because a lot of it is I want this guy transplanted. I believe in him. Somebody else would say, no, that sounds like a bad idea. And I said, well, last week we transplanted your guy. That it wasn't such a great candidate. You're going to transplant this guy. And that's what it is. It's back room, and it, we called it the selection committee. And that's what you were doing, is you were selecting people that were going to live.
Which also means you're selecting people that aren't going to live too, by default.
That's exactly right.
Wow. I can see why you got out of that.
I think 25 years was enough, don't you?
You lasted 24 and a half longer than I would have.
Right. I actually, a few years past what my wife wanted me to do. So.
Well, I'm sure you don't even think about the families of people that do this stuff, because it's really, everybody, when somebody has a job like that, it affects every single person in their life. It's not just
that right. And I actually, that was part of the reason I wanted to write the novel, is I wanted to really, look at the interpersonal relationships that happen or don't happen because of the responsibilities associated with the job. So that's in the book too.
How long is a transplant surgery? Give me a range of lung transplant, since that's what you did.
6 to 8 hours was a rule of thumb. It was in there. Some a little bit shorter, some a little bit longer, but 6 to 8 hours would be considered average.
So you're standing up in an operating room for 8 hours potentially.
Yep.
Man. That's a level of intense concentration. That's a long time to concentrate. And it's not something where you can go start thinking about other stuff. You have to
good footwear is key.
Yeah. And it's a team, obviously. It's
Yeah.
not just you.
No, the whole thing's the ultimate team sport. I mean, someone asked me the other day what I miss the most. I mean, just like an ex-athlete, I miss the team. I really do. I mean, what I do now is fantastic. Believe me, I love it. But it's largely a solitary endeavor. And I had a team of 55 people at Stanford, and I miss them. I miss being part. I miss being part of a team.
And it must be an incredible adrenaline rush to just go in there and go, what's going to happen? This is going to be, I mean, it's just it must be intense. I mean, were you like an intense athletic guy or something before that? What kind of personality did you have?
Yeah, I have an athletic background that I'm a workout fiend, and so I kind of equated it that way. Especially when I was working in the hospital, I worked out, exercised pretty hard, and I worked pretty hard, and I didn't have trouble getting out of bed. I didn't set an alarm clock, despite the dog ass tired that I was. I didn't set an alarm clock for 25 years. I mean, I was out of bed at 4 a.m. to the gym, ready to go. Never had trouble motivating myself to get going.
Yeah. Well, that's the doctor I would want. I'll tell you that. That's I saw this fascinating story on a guy. He was a surgeon of some kind. I don't remember. His story was that he was a juvenile delinquent. It's a nice way of putting it. He was a young teen criminal, basically. And he was talking about in this interview that he was basically an adrenaline junkie, and he got his adrenaline by getting in trouble and almost getting caught. Trying not to get caught. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he was being driven home after it was his it was like a third, some type of a felony robbery or something. And the parole guy or his, whoever the guy was said, listen, I can't help you anymore. If you do one more thing, you're going to prison. And so he goes, I cut my friends loose and I got a job. And I got a job delivering furniture. And I went to this house one day. It was a really nice house. And I'm bringing in this furniture, and I'm talking to the owner. And I asked him what he did. And he said he was a surgeon. He was a doctor. And he said, you could do this. Anyone can do this that's smart and motivated. I can tell you're a guy that's pretty bright. And he kind of told, the kid told him his story, and he said, well, you're like the perfect guy to be a surgeon because, adrenaline is really what it's all about. and he goes, well, this is a really nice house, and I kind of want this. And this kid went to medical school, got through it, became a surgeon, and he's got tattoos up and down his arms. This guy's was in his 50s when I saw this documentary. He'd been doing it a long time. Had a great life, and he was still saying, he goes, this was the perfect job for me that I could do, or I wasn't going to wind up in prison.
Right.
And he goes, the rush of doing these surgeries is exactly like the rush of robbing a house. Or and I thought it was a fascinating story of taking somebody who has an ability, clearly an ability that was misdirected, and he redirected himself out of, wanting something more. And I'm sure most of his friends went by the wayside, and it didn't end well for them. But it was a fascinating story.
Yeah, I write something similar in my first book. I can't remember the exact language I used, but I said something like, when I first got exposed to transplant as a very young person, and while I was in training, and the first night we did a transplant, it was much better than anything a dealer on the street corner could give you. I mean, there's nothing like it. I mean, I haven't, I don't know that I'll ever find anything, quite like it. It's, you're walking on air, and, when it goes well, and then when it goes badly, you're doing the exact opposite. It's a pretty bad crash.
I would imagine it would be pretty devastating.
Yes, it is.
So let's talk about the title of your book and what else, where people can find it. And if, I don't know if you have other things going on where people can contact you, but let's start with your book.
Yeah, so my novel is called All That Really Matters. My main character is trying to figure out all that really matters. And it's easy to find wherever you buy books. And finding out more about me is also pretty easy. It's just davidweill.com. My last name, WEILL.com. So at davidweill.com. Bunch of things that I've written, a lot of op-eds about various subjects, what I'm up to, my books, of course, and it's pretty easy to see what I'm doing.
Great. That's the place to go if you want to find out anything more about what we've been talking about here, because it's wow, what a great conversation. I learned things, which I always love to do on these things. I like to know a little bit, and then I like to find out a bunch more when I actually talk to the person, and that's what happened today. I appreciate your time. I really do. And your great insights.
Well, you're a great interviewer, so I appreciate it. I really do. It's I know it's difficult to extract some of these concepts, but you did a great job.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, because I never know what's going to happen. This is sort of like my version of surgery.
That's right. That's right. It's adrenaline.
What's going to happen?
Yep. I know.
Conversational surgery. That's what I do. That's my new title.
There you go.
Conversational surgeon.
There you go.
All right. Well, see, now I've got a whole new branding thing I can do for myself.
Exactly.
If I actually cared to brand myself, that's right. What I would. That's the new moniker right there. Well, David Weill, you have a fantastic evening, and I really appreciate your time. What a wonderful conversation, folks. Check out his book. You got to do this, because we found out things already. Just the section where the selection committee is going on. That's the part I want to read, because that sounds amazing.
Yep.
I mean, I want to read the whole thing, but
I bring you into that room.
I maybe I don't want to do that. I don't know. Yeah, I do. I want to know.
Yep. Peek in there.
I want to know.
Yep.
All right. Well, you have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate the interview.
Much appreciation for you folks listening to The Exploding Human. The website is theexplodinghuman.com. There's a YouTube channel where you can listen. That is The Exploding Human with Bob Nickman. I want to thank Dr. David Weill for being on the show. Please check out his new book, All That Really Matters. And you can learn more about what David is up to at davidweill.com. Have a fantastic day. Thank you.